This is my cheap, beginner-friendly Walstad shrimp jar and it's 3 months old today. I know this might not be much to look at, but it's a very easy, low-maintenance way to get involved in the shrimp keeping hobby that pretty much anyone can use. One thing that I would say is that this jar is 6.5 litres in size or 1.7 US gallons, and this is on the smaller end of what I'd recommend, with larger always being better. I chose the Walstad method for this project because it's a cheap and easy way to use live plants for natural water purification rather than using a filter, and space is definitely at a premium, so a Walstad style setup is usually going to be the best option for this kind of jar. So let's go over the things that you're going to need if you want to build your own shrimp jar. I'm using a large biscuit jar or cookie jar if you're in North America that fluctuates between 10 and 20 pounds depending on the vendor that currently has them available on Amazon. I do know some people who use old food jars that are large enough for this type of project, with old pickle jars usually being the more popular option. Most types of topsoil should work fine, but if you are in the UK, this is the specific brand that I use because a lot of the American ones aren't available here that you see recommended online, but I've used this in countless tanks now without issue. This is the exact gravel that I'm going to be using for this project, and I know this is definitely available in most of Europe and North America, but most fine gravels and sand will work for this method with ease. I'm just using a cheap clip-on USB low lumen light for this project, and I'm actually surprised by how well it's performed because these are very cheap. These are the plants that I'll be starting this project with, but I will leave a plant list in the video description. So let's get onto the actual shrimp jar setup. I started by cleaning the jar, and this only takes a minute or two, so it's well worth doing, especially if your jar used to be used for food storage. Next, I sieved my topsoil and I tried to remove as many pebbles, twigs and other type of debris as possible. I do usually say this is optional when using a Walstad aquarium, but for a shrimp jar I do think this is more important because you want as much space to be utilised as possible, so you don't want a pebble taking up a large amount of space. Sieving your soil only takes a minute or two, and I managed to remove all of this debris from the small amount of soil that I'll be using. Next, I added the soil to the jar and I'm trying to get an even 1-inch layer across the bottom of the jar. I do know some people who use more or less soil without any major problems, but 1 inch is a good target to aim for. Next up, I added a capping layer of fine gravel to lock the nutrients into the soil and prevent it causing problems with my water parameters. I use a 1-inch layer of fine gravel, but I do know some people who prefer a far thicker capping layer for this type of setup, but I really don't think it's needed. Diana Walstad recommends that you use 3/4 of an inch if you are using sand rather than fine gravel, so your plant roots can get through the sand easier. She also recommends against using much hardscape in Walstad projects, especially smaller containers like this, because the hardscape takes up space that your plants can occupy. That said, I did really want to use this coconut hide with a Java fern attached to it in this particular project, so the shrimp would have a dark hiding space in there. With this being a shrimp jar, moss is going to be a key plant to include, so I decided to cover the coconut hide in moss. This was easy to do, and I just split the cup of Java moss up into smaller sections and then glued them onto the coconut hide. I do think that this is a nice middle ground for this type of project because it lets me add the little hiding spot for the shrimp in the jar, but it also makes sure that it's covered in plants to help with water purification. Once I was happy, I added the coconut hide to the shrimp jar as I wanted this to be the main centerpiece for the project. Next up, I added a crypt Wentii green to the tank as I wanted this to be a large secondary feature in the mid-ground. I cut most of the immersed grown leaves off the crypt to try and prevent a melt stage, as a large amount of decaying leaves in this small jar would cause problems. But in hindsight, this might have been a mistake. Once I was happy, I added the crypt to the jar and placed it alongside the coconut to form the mid-ground of the project. My initial idea was to pack the background of the jar with stems and to use hairgrass for some foreground plants. I chose Rotala rotundifolia and Hygrophila polysperma as the stem plants of choice, as these are relatively easy to grow and they do well in low light. Since planting this jar, I have seen Diana Walstad mention that she often has problems with Hygrophila in her own projects, and I have had issues in some of my aquariums with it as well, so I probably would have went with double Rotala rotundifolia if I could rewind time. I added the stems to the background of the jar, not really caring about their actual placements and focusing on getting them into the substrate to hope that they'd root as quickly as possible. Next up was the hairgrass, and I opted for the easiest type of hairgrass on the market to try and avoid any problems because this is a Walstad shrimp jar with a low powered light light and no heater. I added clumps of the hairgrass to the foreground of the shrimp jar, hoping that it would fill out over time as the plant grows. With the planting being complete, it was time to add water to the jar, and I filled it using a bucket and siphon, but there are a few ways you could do this. Just try to make sure you don't disturb the capping layer of sand or gravel, because any soil in the water column can cause problems. It's totally normal for trapped gas to escape the soil and gravel at this stage, and looking back I probably would have done it slightly differently and added a couple of inches of water to the soil and gravel and then left it overnight before planting for the gas to escape. I placed the jar on the bottom of one of my aquarium racks and plugged the USB clip-on light in. This is a very cheap light, sold as a full spectrum 5-watt light, and I'm not sure if that's true, but I can't find any info on the actual lumen output. I was actually surprised by the amount of light this kicked out, in all fairness, and I also like the initial look of the shrimp jar under this type of light. Here's a top-down view of the jar at this stage, so you can see how I try to pack the background with stems and then add other plants to the mid and foreground. As usual, I took some spare salvinia from one of my other aquariums to use as the floating plant in this tank, and the idea was to add one single piece and then just see how long it would take to cover the entire surface of the jar. The Cryptwentii green did grow for the first 2 weeks or so, and new leaves were starting to be produced, but it didn't take long for it to fail and I had to remove it from the jar. I checked the water parameters at the end of week 4 and everything seemed fine. Algae and biofilm was visible on the jar and the various surfaces in there, so I was confident that there would be enough food in there to add shrimp. A layer of algae and biofilm was also starting to form as a sort of skin on the surface of the jar that I initially kept trying to remove. I moved 4 cherry shrimp over to the jar from one of my aquariums and they seemed to settle in fine. I also decided to add a horned nerite snail to try and deal with the algae and biofilm on the glass so I'd have a clear view of the project. Unfortunately, the nerite snail had other ideas and it spent the majority of the first week grazing on the coconut hide and didn't go anywhere near the glass. Thankfully, the nerite snail did start to adventure around the jar and I've seen him on the glass on a regular basis now, but he does still like to graze on the coconut hide. The cherry shrimp in the jar graze on the algae and biofilm on all of the plants, the coconut hide and anything laying on the substrate. After noticing that the algae grown on the substrate in the jar was actually growing faster than the cherry shrimp could eat it, I decided to add a single Ormano shrimp. This really was a game changer and I saw a noticeable reduction in the amount of algae in the jar day on day until there was barely any left. Unlike my aquarium tanks that tend to be picked clean of algae by my shrimp, there is usually sections in this jar with small amounts of algae constantly grown. I actually found it quite interesting watching the shrimp eat so much algae every single day, as they'll produce waste after eating the algae, but the plants will use the nutrients from the waste for plant growth, creating a little ecosystem. One thing to note is that I actually created this shrimp jar in the middle of December without adding a heater. I really don't like being hot, so my house isn't as hot as the average home, and I did check the water temperature every day, and the lowest I've noted this jar was 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. I would guess that throughout the winter months it averaged around 18 degrees Celsius or 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and I know that this might sound bad if you're only used to tropical aquariums, but the lowest recommended water temperature for Neocaridina shrimp is actually 14 degrees Celsius or 57 degrees Fahrenheit, which is lower than the tracked temperatures. It's currently March and I still check the water temperature of this jar on a regular basis, and it usually averages around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit right now, and this is probably due to the insulation of the house trapping more heat throughout the day. I honestly think that with this specific setup, the water temperature is more of an issue for the plants rather than the inverts, but more on that later. So moving on to how the jar is today, and this is what it's currently looking like. I do top up the water every week or two depending on when it needs it, and as you can see it is due a top up. The surface algae pretty much stays at this state now without getting any worse, so I don't even try and remove it anymore. I've actually seen the shrimp and the snail feeding on it a couple of times, but I haven't been able to catch it on camera yet. The horned nerite snail in this tank does seem to really enjoy eating the surface algae, and I do see him crawl up to feed on any leftover algae after a water top up. The Rotala rotundifolia and the Hygrophila polysperma have never been trimmed, and as you can see they are starting to pop out of the top of the jar. One thing that I would say is that the Hygrophila polysperma has been a consistently good growth throughout all temperatures in this jar. Although the Rotala rotundifolia has caught up, it only started to really grow at a rapid pace in the last couple of weeks, so it does seem to have to wait until it gets warm warmer water temperatures to grow. The Java fern in here does seem to have grown quite a bit as well, and the Java moss does seem to have grown too, but nowhere near as much as it would in my aquariums with warmer water. I do see the shrimp grazing on the Java moss in this jar on a regular basis, but they definitely seem to prefer the stem plants in this particular setup, but I'd guess that's because there's a larger surface area there and there's more biofilm and algae for them to eat on it. The dwarf hairgrass in the tank hasn't really grown much, but it hasn't failed either. It's kind of in a weird middle ground. I think it's just cracking on and doing its own thing, and I do see the shrimp pick at it from time to time, but it is rare. The salvinia in this jar has to compete with the surface algae, so it really doesn't grow at a rapid pace like in all of my aquariums, and it does get absorbed by the algae from time to time. I've never actually added any type of food to this tank, be it food for the shrimp or fertilizer for the plants. I consider this to be a closed ecosystem, and the only thing that I do add to it is dechlorinated water to top up the water when required. I have seen some people say that you have to feed your shrimp high mineral foods on a semi-regular basis to help them with molting, but I don't even do that to my main aquarium shrimp, and I've got 4 pretty established tanks where the Neocaridina shrimp in them are breeding constantly without problem. Just to touch on the maintenance, and there's only really 2 things that I do with this jar. The first is to turn the light on and off at the start and end of my work day as the jar sits on my workbench, and this only takes a second. The only other thing I really do is top up the water levels, and I usually do this once every week or 2 depending on when it needs it, and I just use water that I'm using for my top ups for my fish tanks. I was actually quite surprised by how little maintenance this shrimp jar required, but the warmer summer months are approaching and I may need to trim the stem plants from time to time. Moving on to the water parameters of the shrimp jar, and I've never actually had to do a water change, but I do check the water parameters once a week, but the low bioload of shrimp is easily managed by the stem plants in here. Unlike a full-blown Walstad aquarium that might need a large number of stem plants, especially if you're adding larger fish to the tank, these small jars do well with a couple of stems to keep your costs as low as possible. I am actually thinking of setting up a few more of these using the trimmings from the stem plants in my aquariums to just remove the costs of the plants. Depending on your situation, you may be able to use topsoil from your garden, helping to reduce costs further as well. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I do know a few people who use old pickle jars or other types of food jars for this kind of project. Just to clarify though, I'm not talking about the small 500-gram pickle jars that you can see in regular supermarkets. It's usually the huge ones that people who own burger vans or food takeaways will buy from places like Costco, where they are a couple of litres or a couple of gallons in size. But these can be a good way to keep your costs low if you can get those jars. I just want to quickly touch on some common criticisms that I see people make with this type of shrimp jar or jararium on social media and Reddit. The most common one that I see is that the jars are not cycled correctly, and it is on a case-by-case basis, but a lot of the time I totally agree with some of the photographs that are shared on Reddit or social media. My jar was left for an entire month to let the plants establish themselves in the substrate and start to grow in, and then I used my test kit to check the water parameters before adding any shrimp or snails. I would highly recommend that you do this as well, as it helps to manage your water parameters and keep everything safe. Thankfully, shrimp do have a very small bioload, and some fast-grown stem plants should easily be enough to deal with the ammonia levels from their waste. Another common criticism that I see is regarding the stocking levels of some people's shrimp jars, and I totally agree. Some people are definitely overstocking their shrimp jar. Unfortunately, there isn't an accurate way to advise people how to stock their shrimp jar, because the natural water purification methods and stuff like that will all come into play with what you should keep in your jar. Another issue is if your shrimp start to breed, but thankfully I have plenty of other aquariums that I can move baby shrimp over to if needed to prevent this jar from becoming overstocked. One final criticism that I see that I want to touch on, and I completely disagree with, is that there is a problem in shrimp jars if the shrimp are not swimming around. I honestly think it's a total opposite, and if the shrimp in your aquariums are constantly swimming around, you're the one with the problem. I have shrimp in 2 8-gallon tanks, a 12-gallon tank, a 29-gallon tank, and a 40-gallon tank, and it is extremely rare that I see multiple shrimp swimming around at the same time consistently. The vast majority of the time they are on the plants or hardscape grazing on their food, just like they do in this jar. Anyway, I do really think that shrimp jars are a great, cheap, easy way to dip your feet in the shrimp keeping hobby, and I do plan to try more of them in the future. Here's a little time lapse of the growth of this shrimp jar between day 0 and day 90 that some people may enjoy, and thanks for watching guys, have a good day.